So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for coming. So today's session is basically about Michael Breen's new book, which happens to be called The New Koreans. It's available if you guys want to buy it at a very reasonable price. So no one actually came here to listen to me talk, so I'll be very brief, well, except for my wife, probably. But even then, she's probably leaving me anytime. So I'll be very quick. Michael Breen, he first went to South Korea in 1982, right? So before I was born, so a very long time ago, I'm sure. He worked as a correspondent for Guardian, Financial Times, Washington Times, yes. And now you're a writer and a consultant, right? So, since 1982, a lot has happened in both North and South Korea. Michael Breen has seen it all. He has had lunch with Kim Jong-il, right? Kim Il-sung, before he died, obviously. 3 months before he died, right? You've been sued by Samsung for writing a satire piece about Christmas presents, right? So I'm going to ask you already from the start of the book. I read it and I loved it, and it's a very keen insight into these new Korean psyche, what explains how South Korea went through such a fast development. But you start with a tragedy, the sinking of the ferry. And you say that South Koreans, despite everything, they're actually not very proud of their country. And they're very quick to say what went wrong, right?
Yeah, that's so. Well, thanks for that kind introduction. Yeah, no, that is true. One of the interesting things I find about this is, which I think probably is the case in other countries, I don't know. And for countries which, I think a lot of countries look at South Korean development and in some ways try and copy what is useful for them. The South Koreans a generation ago, basically to put this in context, when South and North Korea were split in 1948, these two countries, their economic level was around the same as Haiti, Sudan, Ethiopia. They were very, very poor countries. Pakistan, for example, was higher in GDP than Korea was. And now, as I'm sure you all know, it's an OECD country and it's right up there, one of the top economies in the world. And in that story, when that was happening, the South Koreans were taught to sacrifice themselves for the national interest. And so South Koreans, by the way, I mean, as you might be able to tell from my accent, I'm British. And British people, in my experience, there's no Brits here, are there? No? Good. Oh, there's one there. Are kind of economically stupid. Like if you asked an English person, what's the per capita GDP of Britain? They'd go, what does GDP mean? Like they wouldn't know what you're talking about. Now I might be exaggerating this a bit, but South Koreans grew up, they knew all this stuff. Instead of having stories in the paper about some, actresses and actors and this and that and celebrities and all that stuff, in the old days, the stories were all about economics. So the people became very economically literate. And they were taught to sacrifice themselves, as I said, for the country. But you know something? Sacrificing yourself for the country doesn't necessarily make you proud of the country. It doesn't necessarily fulfill you. That's one point I'll put on one side. Then the other point, I'm answering your question here. The other side is the Koreans, North and South, have a very long and very rich history. They have a mythical history which goes back about 5,000 years, and a recorded history that goes back, I think, about 2,300 years or something. And the country, if you look at North and South Korea as one country, that border with China and Russia, that territory was established about 1,300 years ago. So they've had a very long and very rich culture. But when they came into the 20th century, this history had done nothing for them. You know, this history delivered them to the bottom of the global rankings. So
we're obviously talking about what happened after the Korean War, where both countries were pretty much destroyed.
Well, no, I'm before the Korean War. And then, so they come into the 20th century, and then Japan colonizes them. So for 40 years, they're a Japanese colony, in which their identity is also hammered. So the message from Japan is, you guys don't amount to much. Now you do because you're part of us, you know. But the Korean history, you know, so that it's reinforcing something. Then they get split in two, so there's huge identity issues. And as I said before, at that point they were one of the poorest countries in the world. And then you had the war that just pulverized them into, you know, back to the not to the Stone Age, but. So, in a way, all this great history didn't do anything for them. So the greatest moment in this, whatever you want to call it, 2,300 or 5,000 year history is now. You know, the Koreans are more proud of their Samsung factories than they are of some old palace or something, you know.
Yes, there's one anecdote, a funny one, is that you mentioned the fact that all the palaces, the historical palaces in Seoul, are not lit at night. There's no floodlights to indicate, oh, this is an important historical site that we should be proud of, right? There is this kind of warped feeling towards their own history?
Yeah, well, the anecdote that I gave then was I was actually in a men's toilet, if you want to know the actual truth, doing what men do in the men's toilet next to a Korean friend of mine. And the window here looked over, for those of you who know Seoul, it looked over Doksu Palace. But it was all dark. And so we had this kind of strange dialogue. I say, what's that? Why is it all dark over there? And he said, oh, it's because we don't care. So what are you talking about? So you're standing here like this. Because we don't care. So, what do you mean you don't care? We don't care about it. About what? About the palace. Oh, it's the palace, that's right. So why is it dark? We're not proud of our history, we don't care. Now, I think he was a tourism expert, this guy, so he was making a point to me. But I think there's another historical reason where historically you're not supposed to see into the palaces. So it's only more recently that people have seen the tourism value of them. And actually in front of one of the main palaces in Seoul now, there's floodlights in front of it. This is quite new. But yeah, for a long time, they were the darkest parts of the city, surrounded by tall buildings where the lights were burning way until 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night. These people still at work, you know.
So yeah, that kind of shows how, as you said, history was kind of pushed back into, you know, a very distant path, although it was still in the memory of people, of course. You know, people who are still alive today still remember the horrible times after the war. So at the same time, as you say, they are proud of the economic growth that they have. But at the same time, there is kind of a backlash, a permanent almost backlash against the big conglomerates, you know, Samsung, you know, all the other ones that control just about all of the economy. How is that, you know, feeling? Because we're also talking about lots of people who actually work for these companies. And just like in Japan, there's this feeling of loyalty. You get hired by Samsung, you work all your life for Samsung, right?
Yeah, there's a love-hate relationship. The love is because when the in 1960s, when the military dictator of the time decided to develop the country, he consciously, actually they looked at Taiwan as an example. Now, as you probably know, Taiwan has developed on the strength of small and medium industries, a lot of small companies. He realized this wouldn't work because you can't control, you know, 5,000 companies can't be controlled so easily. And also because in the Korean business culture, there's a very low level of trust. So in cultures where you have low trust, you need big companies run by powerful people to keep everybody in line. So they deliberately went for this model of the big conglomerates, the chaebol, as they call them. Some of them are famous now. Samsung, Hyundai, Daewoo collapsed, LG. And the love comes from two things. One is that these companies built up the country. Hyundai in particular is most loved because it was a nation builder. And the second reason is that these are the companies that people aspire to work for. You know, the hate comes from the fact that there's a Korean saying to the effect that when a tree grows tall, the smaller trees in its shadow wither and fade away. So the businessmen who are lucky enough to have their companies develop into huge conglomerates do so at the expense of a lot of other people. And by the way, the way it worked was quite extraordinary. Have you heard of the Daewoo Group? Some of you may have heard of it. Daewoo was one of the big ones, and it collapsed in the Asian financial crisis. And the head of that company, his father had been the dictator's teacher at school, one of his teachers, so there was a connection there. And he started life making shirts. This guy, he went, I think he went to, was it Vietnam? Or he may have come over this way, I'm not sure. Somewhere, he came to Southeast Asia, bought some shirts, took them back to Seoul, and he unstitched them to figure how they were made, and then started copying them. And within a couple of years, he had a multi-million-dollar business going, making shirts. And the president, as I said, the president was aware of him. And cut a long story short, the president sort of said, have you thought of shipbuilding? Can't say I have. No, sir. Well, look, we've got a collapsed shipbuilder here. I want you to take it over. Okay, sir, I'll do that. And then they do what they have to do. Korea became one of the world's great shipbuilders with that kind of amateurish beginning, you know, with these companies with no experience. But the hatred is because of that domination of the economy. And these, you know, since I've been in Korea, every administration has said they want to reduce the power of these conglomerates, and none has been able to do it. You know, so it remains a problem for the economy going forward.
But in your book, you do say that you believe that society will force these conglomerates to change. Also because you do mention that besides from, as you say, their weight in the economy, there's also the issue that within the work, their corporate culture is it's terrible. You know, workers are institutionally bullied by their superiors. Do you see the recent trial of the president of Samsung as a turning point, or just another cyclical?
No, I don't think the trial of the president is a turning point on that, because I think he got caught up in politics. But all of those sort of issues of a very militaristic corporate culture, very untransparent way of doing business, that's all gradually improving. But no government can really go the whole way and do what they have to do, because the economy depends so much on these big groups. You know? But it's getting better.
The success of South Korea, your book also says it, was probably the first of an authoritarian, centralized government, as you said, telling even the conglomerates what you should do now. That, okay, you should go shipbuilding now, or later on, you should start construction companies to go to the Middle East. So, should we have been as surprised as we were from the development of China? Because the model of China followed a particularly similar. We're talking about state-owned companies that were told what to do by the government. Why were we so surprised that it worked? I mean, it worked in South Korea.
Well, yes, it did work, and it's worked in China. But I think we could point to other examples, like in the communist world, where it hasn't worked. And I think leadership is an enormous factor. I never understood on the ground how this happened, but when I was researching for the book, I happened by chance I was introduced to an elderly gentleman. He's sort of in his mid-80s, and I'd never heard of him before, but he had been the dictator's aide, responsible for implementing the economic policies. And he told me how it actually worked. And it was quite fascinating. He said, this country, our country didn't develop according to a plan. You don't call these American or European advisors to come in and say, well, what do we do now? In fact, if you do that, you might get some bad advice, because it doesn't apply to you. It applies to their experience, So it was a bit of a trial and error. But the president, this is going back to what I was saying about the Koreans being economically literate. The president would set objectives. He would say, how did it begin now? I forget the figures now, but it was something like, okay, our country, we have $100 million of exports every year, and our average wage is, $300, something like that. Okay, so in 3 years, we want to increase that to $1 billion and $1,000 thing. And then he would turn to his staff and say, give me the plan. So he would just set, this is the goal. Give me the plan. And a lot of people got fired. This was a method learned in the military, in the Japanese military. He had been an officer in the military and was involved in Manchukuo, in Manchuria, when the Japanese military tried to develop Manchuria along with businesses. And the Japanese experience came from the Prussians. And the Prussian way in a military is very interesting, is the general will set a goal, an objective. Now, in most other militaries, everyone's getting ordered down the line, field officers down the line to the side, do that, shoot that person, But in the Prussian sense, what they do is they will give an objective to a field commander, and then he'll give objectives to his junior officers. And then it's up to them how to do it, different from other militaries in the old days. And that's what they did in Korea. And the people who fail, there's no mercy, you're out. So what this guy did was he helped develop plans, and he lasted for 10 years, so he was actually very successful. He would say, I think when the goal became $10 billion, he said, sir, the only way we can do this is if we go into heavy chemical industries and things like that. So he said, okay, give me a plan then. All right? So then this guy would ring up these conglomerate heads and call them in. And I asked him, I said, who was your favorite, who did you like and who did you not like? And I was hoping he was going to say, I didn't like Samsung, because I don't like Samsung. But anyway, he said Hyundai. He said the head of Hyundai, bring him in, you give him an impossible task, and he'd just go, okay. And he would do it. And he got all the government contracts as a result. And the other groups all started to realize this is what you have to do. And in that way, and then what happens when they meet a goal, so 3 years later, there they are with $1 billion of export, everyone's congratulating themselves, then the president goes, right, 10 billion. And this went on up to, and he was assassinated actually while in this process. So the final goal, it just continued. By that time, the country had got into this scheme of things. So, well, that's a long answer to your question, but if in China, if the people setting the vision are setting a good vision, then it works. You know, then central control planning works to a point. Then I think there comes a point where you just have to allow freedoms, and you know. So.
I mean, eventually in Korea you had that. You had a point where it became a democracy, where you had, you know, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. You know, you had parties, you had a normal Western-style democracy. But you say that despite everything, South Koreans are in a pit of depression. You say that, you know, the suicide rates are very high, the highest in OECD. So why is that?
Yeah, you know, I would say, by the way, if you meet a South Korean, you should put your arms around them and give them a little hug, you know, because they're very miserable people. It's quite astonishing. There's more unhappiness among Koreans now than there was when they were poor. And I think the statistical evidence is, here's a country, when I first went, everybody I knew had 5 or 6 brothers or sisters. And now they have one of the lowest birth rates in the world and one of the highest suicide rates in the world. These are 2 very distressing statistics. I think it's partly because, let me see, if you take America, for example, think of America. What is the vision of America? Forget about Donald Trump for a minute. What is the vision of America and the purpose of government? The vision is for human individual fulfillment. This is enshrined in the Constitution and the documents. And the role of government is to facilitate that. You know, what is it? The happiness, whatever, of the people. I forget the thing. South Korea's national objective has been economic growth. Why? To defend against North Korea. Because one day the Americans will go. The objective or the vision of South Korea is not the happiness of its people. And you're now seeing where actually the values of the country are changing. They're becoming democratic values. And I think they're going to have to start articulating this because until now, people have been sacrificed for the sake of the nation. And now there's got to be a change in that, I think. So I think that's one of the explanations. I think there are other things culturally where Koreans, I don't know if it's like that in this part of the world, but Koreans are acutely sensitive to what other people think of them. And they are, it's very difficult for them to make decisions, even like things about who they marry, what jobs they take, what majors they study at university, that goes against what they're being told, you know. And that is also a source of unhappiness, because people don't feel fulfilled. They're living a life according to what they think other people think they should be doing, you know, which is a bit complicated, but, you know.
Yes, there's one funny anecdote. You say you used to have lunch with the brother of the president of a conglomerate who had been given, you know, a presidency of one smaller company, and he wouldn't really do anything. And you said that he admitted to you that he would rather be doing music than being a businessman, and yet he wouldn't do it, right? So, but about that, I would like to ask you this issue of, you know, people being very sensitive to what other people think, and, you know, keeping up with what everyone else says is the right thing to do. Because you mentioned the issue of academic pressure on children and teenagers, this issue that you need the best grades to get into the best high schools, to get into the best universities, to get top of your class, because only those ones get picked. I wanted you to talk about that a little bit, because we do sense that here in Macau as well. You know, parents here do sense that academic pressure, that you need to start teaching your kids as soon as possible so they can get into the best kindergartens. Right. And then the pressure will only increase. Is that a big part of the problem?
It is this intense competition. Don't know where to start with this, but you know, for example, I mean, it starts with mothers, pregnant mothers, playing Mozart to their babies, you know, to make them smarter or something.
Sorry to interrupt, but me and my wife, that very pregnant lady over there, we've just been to a Mozart and classical music concert. So.
Okay, okay, you got a... and then, you know, in kindergarten, it's sort of English lessons, music. It's like the poor little things are being sort of driven to perform. There's intense competition between mothers, particularly in kindergarten and elementary school, along with some guilt, because most of the mothers are working. And they feel a bit guilty because their mothers are probably telling them, you shouldn't be working, you should be taking care of the kid, you know. That's part of it. It's also that, I hadn't noticed this at the time, but people have told me that when the Asian financial crisis of 1997-98, I've been told that before that, there was this sort of collective thing that we're all in it together. You know, people worked hard, there wasn't welfare, there still isn't much welfare. So you have to work hard. But we're all in it together. But after the Asian financial crisis, when a lot of people lost their jobs, and a lot of men would not tell their family, they would leave work with their suit on in the morning, go off to the mountains, take the suit off, put it somewhere and go for a walk in the mountains. You know, they wouldn't tell people they were unemployed. But a lot of people, a lot of small businesses collapsed. And after that, people realized that then the competition came in. People realized if these kids in my daughter or my son's class are doing well, my child is going to suffer. You know, so this competition sort of came in. But the irony is that the thing that they're competing for is not education per se. It's sort of membership of an elite club. You know, I don't. Anybody here? Did anybody here go to Harvard, Oxford, or Cambridge? No? Good. Because I mean, I've met 80-year-old Koreans who went to Harvard, and within 30 seconds of meeting them, they'll say, "I went to Harvard." And the thing is in Korea is there are only a handful of universities that you're really proud of having gone to, which means everybody else who doesn't get there, and a huge, I don't know what it is, 70, 80% of young people go to universities. I think it's the highest in the world, percentage of high school leavers. Everyone who doesn't get to a good university feels like a loser. This is also part of the unhappiness thing, you know. And now it's made worse because there aren't the jobs. There are people who spend 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years applying to be journalists, lawyers, or government officials. That's all they do. Study, apply, have a little study group with other people doing the same. And they end up sort of running a coffee shop somewhere, so they end up feeling like losers, you know. I forgot what the original question was now. But
so
anyway.
Personal happiness is not yet valued. It's more about, you know, what do you do? Yeah. So you're not, you know, a general manager of a company, so what's wrong with you?
Because also the, again, I'm not sure if it's the same here, but the titles you get in a Korean company, in Korean it's like kwajang, bujang, kukjang, shiljang, it comes from Chinese, I think. There's an equivalence that if you're a kwajang in a government official and you meet a kwajang from Samsung, it's kind of like the military. It's like, oh, he's a colonel. You know, you sort of, whereas in other countries, you can't relate to it. Somebody says, I'm a sort of section leader at Samsung. It's like, what does that mean? I don't know. I mean, does it mean you're in charge of 2 people or 100? I don't know, no idea. You know, so that also makes them very competitive because everybody wants to, like in the military, people don't turn down a rank.
Everybody wants to go up the ranks.
Yeah.
Even if it's, you know...
even if it brings on more stress and, you know...
Yeah. But nobody turns down a promotion, of course.
No, maybe some do, but they're the outliers, I think, yeah.
Okay, before I open the floor, I'm just going to talk about the most controversial, perhaps, part. Well, there's one big controversy in your book, which is you say that Taiwan is a country. So, you know, I'm very surprised that you didn't get barred on entering Macau, but okay. The second controversy, you say that South Korea should change their names. It should change to Hankook, right? Because it's too north-south. There's always this North Korea hanging. So I would like to ask you, even today with these new Koreans, how much is the threat of, you know, the madman in Pyongyang and with his rockets and his nuclear bombs, how much does that weight on the psyche of the new Koreans?
Well, these are two slightly separate things. So let me answer that second bit first. There was a time when the fear of North Korea was very deep in the gut. And because I'd lived there for a while, I sort of picked this up. Before I went to North Korea myself, I kind of picked this up. I remember once going, by the way, the division between the two Koreas is absolute. There is no travel, no letters being written, no nothing. Now, in South Korean media now, South Korea is a democracy, you'll see pictures of North Korea and their leadership is different. But in the old days, no pictures of North Korea. So I went into a government office once, because I was a foreign journalist. I said, I'd like to have a look at some North Korean newspapers. And so they said, yeah, we've got some here, you can have a look. And I went into this little room, and I almost felt like a priest might feel going into a satanic cult thing. You know, it was like some sort of invisible vibe that I had to, you know, and that, I'm a foreigner, you know. And so South Koreans were viscerally, sort of spiritually afraid of North Korea at one point. And that is, I think, because they feared, the government feared, a lot of people feared that the influence of North Korea, potential influence on the South Koreans. Because the North Koreans had a very attractive line that they were selling, which was foreigners, up yours. Whereas the South Koreans are sort of obeying the Americans, and they felt bad about themselves. It's like, oh, you know, we depend on these big powers for protection. The North Koreans are sort of being tough. They're throwing off thousands of years of history in doing that. So it was very appealing, and I think people were afraid of that. And then that's gone now. So the fear of North Korea is one that rightfully it belongs to the military people, the security planners. It's a standard sort of military concern. And you'd be amazed that, you know, I met people coming for the Winter Olympics, particularly from America, who said, oh, my family was telling me I shouldn't go, I'm going to get killed, you know. I said, okay. And then you come to South Korea, nobody cares. You know, actually, you know, this summit meeting that's going on, a lot of people don't care. It's like, we've had it up to here with North Korea. So that's the answer to your first part. The other part, why did I suggest that Korea changes its name? In surveys about the reputation of South Korea, North Korea figures quite highly. It drags the South Korean reputation down, as if North Korea being a sort of pariah state, and its behavior, it's not mad behavior, but it's just not explained. It's seen as sort of taking on the world. All of that is somehow, in some people's minds, seen as Korean. And then people mix the two up. You know, when I used to go in the old days, when I used to go, in fact, I wrote this in the book, that the first time I went back to England after about 3 years in Korea, I was with a group of relatives, and one cousin said, Korea, is that part of Vietnam? And then his dad says, what are you talking about, you idiot? It's a separate country. And then somebody else said, well, it's two countries, actually. And then they looked at me as the expert. I said, yeah, that's right. So that was the level of thing. So, but even now, the North Korea affects it. Why? The same name. You know, and the interesting thing, the fascinating thing about this is the two Koreas have in their diplomatic policies, have been trying to get the world on their side. Now, South Korea's won this, basically, so it's kind of over. But the ironic thing here is that their own names in Korean language for the countries are different. It's only in foreign languages, English, French, and everything else, Portuguese. The word for Korea is a variation of Korea. Korea, 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 with that language for north or south, you know. And there are a few, I think Japan and China use the North Korean names. Hangwo, is it Hangwo? And yeah. So North Korea calls itself Chosun, South Korea calls itself Hanguk. So completely different. So my suggestion is, if you want to keep your reputation protected, change your name. You know, let them have Korea. Who cares? It's not even Korean, you know.
In Korean, it's not Korea, yes. Okay, so I'll open the floor to questions. So please don't be shy. Just raise your hands.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm sorry, I've not yet read your book, so maybe I ask a silly question. But you have always talked about Koreans, etc. But there was no gender mention in your discourse. And the Koreans, I've met quite a lot of Koreans here in Macau and also in Lisbon, who were my students. And for example, what you mentioned about very reputable universities going here and there. And I see a very different attitude in the ladies, in the young girls who go to universities, their purpose in studies, their acceptance, seems to me, of a minor role in society. I know a case of a young lady who married a Portuguese man, and when she had a child and she gave birth to the child was a girl. Her parents refused to have them there because it was unworthy to have another girl in the family, etc. So I'd like to ask you about that.
Yeah, that's quite old-fashioned now. But it was the case a generation ago. It was very serious, you know, because, I mean, obviously in old rural societies, well, not all rural societies, in ancient Korea, as in a lot of other countries, the inheritance went to the boy, the eldest son, who looked after the parents, ran the farm, and the girls went off and married and lived with their husband's family, you know. So there was more value placed on having a son. It was crucial to have a son. And for that reason, in the old days, there were a lot of adoptions within families. So, you know, if I had 3 sons, my brother might legally adopt one. So it might just be on paper. It might not even actually go and live with them. It might just be on paper. I was appalled. It was shortly after I arrived in Korea. I had a British friend with a Korean wife, whose wife was having a baby. And they went to the hospital. He was telling me after, he said, you know, I was in the hospital, and in those days the men were not allowed in with their wives, because these Korean men would sort of faint or start interfering, you know. And my friend said it was appalling, you know. He said we were all sitting there together overnight for several hours, and we kind of become friendly. And then every so often, a nurse would come through saying, Mr. Kim, congratulations, you have a baby boy. And when it was a boy, it was all sort of slapping on the back, yeah, you know, all this sort of stuff. If it was a girl, it was kind of, oh, you know, as if they'd sort of, you know. And my friend was telling me that he's astonished by this. And the more tragic part, and in the old days, sometimes girls didn't even get given names. You know, so there's a very unpleasant history in this. The most unpleasant part, and this has also happened in other countries, is when well, let me tell you the story like this. Around the mid-90s, I think it was, or early 90s, kindergarten teachers started reporting that there were a lot more boys in their class than girls, significantly. In some places, like the city of Daegu, which is very old traditional, it was something like 130 boys for every 100 girls or something. And normally, I think in life, it's about 105 girls for 100 boys. I think that's the normal proportion. And what they found was they dated this back to the arrival of the ultrascan. So when fetuses were identified, they were aborted. So it then became illegal for doctors to tell the parents the sex of the child. But as I say, that has sort of changed now. And I think, and also you have the nuclear family. A lot of families have 1 child, 2 is almost a lot nowadays.
Yeah,
so it's changed.
I see, but what I mean is, already in the 21st century, not many years ago, I had several students from South Korea, and the girls' attitude was not to go to a very good university, or they did not even think of a career, although some of them were brilliant. But when I asked them, what do you study there? Because they came here for the Portuguese summer course, and it was a very agreeable, event and they liked to come. They were all learning Portuguese. But what were they studying as a master? And the girl said something. I said, oh, yes, and what do you intend to do with that? To get married, to have children.
They, again, I wouldn't like to say all society is like this, because it's kind of changing. It changes very quickly. But there's been a tendency there was a tendency for girls to go to try and go to a good university in order to get a good husband.
Yes. Okay.
And so therefore you're right, that what they actually studied didn't matter too much. I think that's changing now. Girls are thinking of careers for themselves. So that, yeah, that was very much the case.
Thank you very much.
So anybody else? Oh, there's one in the back.
I'd just like your comments or opinion on the potential for reunification, even maybe this year, next year.
You know, in 1991, I was having dinner with two diplomats in the American embassy in Seoul, a Korean journalist and another foreign journalist, and we all put a bet on unification. And we all put a date on it. We had to name the day when it happened, and we got $10 out, Korean money, slapped on. I don't know what happened to the money actually, but we all somebody took it. And my choice was April the 15th, which is a little bit cynical because that was the birthday of the North Korean leader, 1992. And I worried if I was being a little bit conservative, you know. The Korean among us was the most conservative, and he said, okay, April the 15th, 1995, you know. So here we are, a generation later, asking the same question. Let me go out on a limb here and say it's not going to happen, okay? The Koreans, I think, will unify when when there are two countries with shared values. If North Korea, the relative size, by the way, land space, North Korea is slightly bigger. Population, North Korea has 25 million, South Korea has 50 million. So it's about half the size. So economically and socially, any sudden unification where the South took responsibility would be very, very difficult to handle, and nobody wants it. I mean, the North Koreans don't want it. The North Korean government does. The North Korean people, we don't know what they want. The South Korean people don't want it, and the South Korean government doesn't want it. That everybody wants to postpone it. I think the more important question, I think, is when will we see the beginning of reconciliation? And that moment is the moment when North Korea has its sort of Deng Xiaoping moment. It's where they start to focus on their domestic economy instead of their security. You know, once they feel that, you know, okay, we're not going to invade you. The Americans, the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Russians, none of us are going to do anything to you. If they can be convinced of that and convinced of focusing on building up their country, then I think you will see the starting point of reconciliation and the starting point of probably a long road. I mean, a generation-long road to unification. I might be completely wrong, but if... actually, I'm often completely wrong, as I told you a minute ago. The other approach would be warfare, which would be very unpleasant. This is a highly populated part of the world, and this would be very, very unpleasant. What I'm interested in seeing is, you know, these these two Koreas they exist in a rivalry. The South Korean constitution, by the way, they don't recognize one another diplomatically or anything. The South Korean constitution says North Korea belongs to us, and North Korean people are our citizens. So when North Korean defectors come, they get processed and they get given an apartment, paid $20,000. Why? Because they're citizens, you know. The North Korea has a similar posture. By the way, the South Koreans are committed to peaceful unification, but it is their national objective is to recover that lost land, you know. The North Koreans have a similar posture, except the Workers' Party constitution commits them to unification by whatever means, including violent means, that means. So they've got the same posture. If somehow these two countries could be persuaded to sort of let that go for a generation, or postpone it, because what is it? It's a land grab and it's a people grab. So, you know, when people start talking about unification too prematurely, like if the North Koreans started saying to us in South Korea, oh, let's talk about unification, I would be, I don't have guns, but I mean, I would be sort of checking my guns were still working, you know what I mean? You get really nervous. So I think this is a very, very complicated process. If it goes the way everybody wants, it will happen. I think I don't think these two countries would just go off in separate directions. Why? I'll quote you, a German ambassador to Korea was asked this question when the Germany's united, you know, will we reunite? And the questioner was suggesting that the Koreas are not uniting because the foreign powers are preventing them. And the answer was, you know, we Germans were divided because of our sin. He used that word. And we needed the approval of the countries we had sinned against to unify, particularly the Russians. But you Koreans were divided because of your innocence, because they were politically weak. So no country can take a position against your unification when it happens. So I think for that reason, there's a historical imperative. It will happen, but I don't think it's a thing that people should be focusing on now. I think they should be focusing on reconciliation and on North Korea focusing on its own development and the well-being of its citizens and giving up this sort of aggressive posture. And by the way, on a final note, I don't think it'll happen with this current regime. And unless for the last 7 years, he's been harboring liberal democratic sentiments, which you never know is possible. Unless I can't see the grandson of Kim Il-sung ever stepping off this pedestal that they're on. I think they're stuck. So I think there has to be a regime change, but I don't think it should be forced from the outside. Something has to happen internally.
Thank you.
I would be curious to know what's your opinion on Kim JongNam's death and about his relationship to his half-brother.
I think what I just said a minute ago, that this young leader might, he grew up in international schools in Europe. I'm sure if he were here today, he would be more comfortable with us than he is with his own people. Do you know what I mean? I'm sure that he, we talk about baseball, he can't talk about what he's interested in with his own people, I'm sure. And so he may be harboring liberal democratic thoughts. But the two things that really stand out that make us sort of wonder about that, whether that's not just a fantasy, is the murder of his brother and the murder of his uncle. You know, you'd think whatever political justification there was for being concerned about them, that's pretty extreme, a pretty extreme way to go. I don't know what the explanation is. Maybe they thought that some exiled Koreans were planning a coup or to set up a government in exile with him as a figurehead leader. I mean, who knows what the thinking was in the background. So it was appalling, an international incident like that, and it shows their contempt for other countries. They tried to assassinate the South Korean president when he was on a trip to Burma in the 1980s. Now they killed Kim JongNam in Kuala Lumpur airport, you know. I mean, this shows their contempt for other countries, and they thought they could get away with it, you know. So, what do I think of it? I think it's appalling, you know. But, you know, in people's zeal to solve this problem, I think they put all this behind, you know, they put it behind them. I don't think he's ever going to get charged for it, you know.
Thank you so much. I'm sure there would be other questions, but we're already running late and there's another session coming in. So again, I would like to thank Michael for talking to us. Again, the book is out there, very reasonable price, so you can all pick them up. So please give a warm call.
Thank you. Thank you.